together and hosting us and just being a wonderful partner. We first met Betty in 2022 when we came and kind of did a deep dive with some folks here on foreign interference in elections and what that looks like. So a little bit about ASD, the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. If you want the full name, it's a lot. But we really look at threats to democracy. Mostly from foreign actors. So we're usually talking about Russia, China, and Iran. And so we're kind of the threats people. And we see that across 5 main areas. That's information manipulation, which Bret here leads all of our work on that. And you're about to see a presentation from him that's, I don't want to pump you up too much, but that I think is quite good. And so information manipulation, malign finance, emerging tech and AI, election security and infrastructure, and then cyber. And we were so lucky to have David Hickton here today with us, the founder of Pitt Cyber, to really, just add such a wealth of knowledge and expertise to this discussion. So you will hear less from me, I promise, and more from these two. But we are just thrilled to be here. We want this. We'll do a little bit, we'll do a presentation, and then we'll do a little bit of me asking these two some questions. But then I want to open it up. What Bret and I really love about being able to do events like this is to hear how you are experiencing these issues and what it looks like in your day-to-day, in your community, at your job. Even in your family. So, as you're processing this, please be thinking of questions. We'll have plenty of time for that after the Q&A. So with that, I will toss it over to Bret.
Thanks, Rachel. And so we're here obviously tonight to talk about the AI threat to elections, but I'm going to start with a story that has nothing to do with either of those things. And so this is the story of the Shed at Dulwich. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Shed at Dulwich, it was a restaurant that popped up in London in 2017. And it billed itself as this sort of very avant-garde, speakeasy kind of place. It didn't have an address listed online. So if you were lucky enough to get a reservation, you were met at a corner, you were sort of whisked away for this elaborate dining experience. And so over the first 6 months of its existence, it kept racking up 5-star reviews and 5-star reviews and 5-star reviews. And within about a half a year, it became the #1 rated restaurant in London on TripAdvisor. And so like every hot restaurant, it became almost impossible to get a reservation. And in fact, it was impossible to get a reservation because the restaurant did not exist. The entire thing was a hoax pulled off by a Vice UK reporter to show how vulnerable ranking systems, review sites are to manipulation. So this is an example of one guy who had no resources. He didn't use AI. He had no real technical capabilities. And within half a year, he was able to take a restaurant that didn't exist and make it the #1 rated restaurant on the most trusted restaurant review site in one of the largest cities in the world. So now we look at it from a different angle. And the threat actor isn't a reporter playing a hoax, but it's a political campaign, it's a nation state, maybe it's an extremist group, and the target isn't a restaurant review site, but it's a political candidate, maybe it's democracy itself. And so that is why I think we're starting to see headlines like this, predicting this sort of tsunami of deepfakes that are going to upend elections. But the important thing to point out here, these headlines are actually from the last 3 major US elections. So that's from 2018, 2020, 2022. We didn't see that. So why does now feel different? Partly because we are starting to see it in other elections around the world. So starting in Argentina in 2023, we saw manipulated images used by both candidates to denigrate each other. And then probably most dangerously, we saw a piece of synthetic audio that was released online ahead of the Slovakian elections earlier this year. This was a very, very close election. It is still unclear if the Russians had any role in this, but it was a piece of audio that had one candidate purportedly saying that they were going to rig the elections. It also had the candidate saying they were going to raise the price of beer, which was probably more problematic for him. But anyway, in a very, very small margin, it's unclear whether or not this had any role, but you see the potential problems. The other reason I think we're talking about AI more this election cycle is because of how easily accessible it is, how affordable it is, how available it is to basically anyone. So going back about 30 years, if you remember the scene from Forrest Gump, where Tom Hanks' character meets with President Kennedy, then President Nixon. This was about 1.5 minutes of the movie. It cost several $100,000 to create those scenes. It took some of the best visual effects artists in the world to create it, and it took months. In 2023, some shady dental company ran an ad with AI Tom Hanks that cost them nothing, and they were able to produce it in a few hours. So this is the sort of collapsing that we've seen in the ability to create very realistic audio, video, text, images that used to require a ton of money, a ton of expertise, and now is available to almost anyone. So now we're going to get to the part where we actually reveal the answers for the few slides that you saw that are posted around the room. And so I'm able to sort of see where people landed on these things. So the first one is, who of these people are real? And that's the answer. And nobody guessed C. There was a mix of the others, and I know those people are real because that's my wife and brother. The next one, and people did better on this one, which of these tweets was written by a Chinese state media outlet, and which of these tweets was written by ChatGPT, which was prompted to write a tweet in the voice of a Chinese state media outlet? I'll give you a second to look at it if you didn't see it before. So A is the right answer. People did pretty well on this one, but again, ChatGPT is amazing. It's getting better and better and better. Third one, a couple images of French President Emmanuel Macron seemingly fleeing from protesters. Now this one is a little bit easier, I think, just because of the scenario around it. So A is the right answer. But the important thing with A is this is actually the image that we saw in a disinformation campaign before the French elections. It was a real image, but it was taken out of context and juxtaposed with actual protests from French farmers. And so in many ways, this is why I haven't been particularly concerned about AI-generated content, not because I don't think it will come, but because the cheap fakes work just as well as the deep fakes for years. You just slap a different headline on something, you add a different date, it's not manipulated in the sense of it's AI generated, you just change the context around, and that's worked perfectly well. So the things that I think are the real risks in terms of AI in information operations, particularly targeting elections, one is this democratization of disinformation. You don't need to be the Russians or the Iranians and have a nation-state-sized budget to run a pretty wide-scale disinformation campaign. That's available to anyone now. It's also improved the speed, the scale, and the volume. So you think of 2016, the Russians had this troll factory in St. Petersburg, right? They needed 100 people in a room, they needed to have some understanding of English, all sort of typing out messages to Americans. Now if they had those same 100 people, the scale would increase tenfold. And you don't need 100 people. So again, a few people could present themselves as being hundreds of thousands of people, cost very little money. And my particular concern is this more precise targeting. So again, threat actors who don't have a particular linguistic capability, so you're sitting in Moscow, you don't speak great English, you run it through ChatGPT, your English is perfect, but you can also personalize disinformation campaigns. And when we look at threats, we often look at threats that exist more in the cybercrime space and scammers. So what we have started to see, and you may have heard some of these stories before, cyber criminals are calling parents, and on the other end of the phone, they hear what seems to be their child screaming in the background, very realistically, and they're asking for ransom. These are just cloned voices, AI generated. So our concern is that what we're seeing cyber criminals do to try to scam parents out of money, we will start seeing those who want to attack elections using the same tactics and techniques. So we're going to play a little bit of this video here, not all the way through, to show maybe how this could work.
It's Tuesday, November 5th, 2024, and it is election day in America. Polls are showing that today will be one of the largest voter turnouts in our nation's history.
Civilians head down the street. Our kids go to school together.
Hi, it's Reverend Jones from the church calling. Hey, Reverend, what's going on? Well, your sister asked me to reach out. Reese, what's up, buddy? It's Danny from the office.
Hey, Care Bear. It's Mom.
Looks like they closed the local polls early. Something about a lack of staff. Anyway, just wanted to
Yeah,
see.
your family's trying to get a hold of you, man. I guess your father, Rodrigo, he's in the
due to a failure in our polling technology, I am using my executive powers to extend the election period. All Americans will have an extra 48 hours to cast their ballots. God bless you, and God bless America.
So, all of those voices were created by AI. Now, I think that scenario is pretty unlikely, that you're going to have hundreds of thousands of people called. But if you were targeting high-profile individuals, election workers, for example, that is a real concern, that they would get calls from people who are their bosses, who are secretaries of state. And so just to kind of wrap up here, and if we can play a couple of these audio clips again.
Hey, this is Bret from down the street. Just wanted to let you know that there was some flooding at our polling place last night, so they're telling us that we need to vote at a different location today.
And now the second one.
Hola, soy Bret de al lado. Solo quería informarles que anoche hubo algunas inundaciones en nuestro lugar de votación, por lo que nos dicen que hoy debemos votar en un lugar diferente.
So that, of course, is my voice, but I never said those things. That cost me zero money, and it was 30 seconds of my voice that got it to be that realistic. Now, it's not perfect, of course. You've heard me speaking, and it's a little bit different. But if you had an hour of somebody's audio, you're going to get better and better and more refined. So that, of course, is a real concern. And I think actually voice cloning is the biggest risk, because video right now, there's still a little bit of glitches there. So just to wrap up, I'm going to give ourselves one more chance to see if we can spot the fakes. So take a look at these pictures of food. Sort of a primal instinct to be able to understand what is real food. So take a second, try to figure out what's real. So who guessed that all of these are fake? Good, you succeeded, because actually all of them are real. And that tends to confuse people more often than not at the end of these presentations, right? Because now we've been sort of, the wheels have been put in motion to not trust things. And that to me is the bigger risk. It's not that we're going to start believing in things that are not real. It's that we'll start doubting what is real. And I'll turn it back to you, Rachel.
Yikes. All right. Yeah, that presentation has the ability to kind of raise anxiety a little bit. But thank you, Bret. It's a good scene setter for what we're facing. And the way we approach this at ASD is we have to know what the threat looks like and how it can be used in order to be prepared. And I don't, have to tell anyone in Pittsburgh that there's high-stake elections happening here, and that y'all are really the center of a lot of activity and a lot of interest. And so I do think it's important, as uncomfortable as it is, to kind of delve into what this could look like and how to best protect yourself. But I will go ahead and start with David. I'd love to hear, just from your perspective, how you see the threat of generative AI, and what, particularly in the election context, in the short term, and how you were thinking about it.
I'm not going to talk tonight because you're going to clone my voice. Well, let me begin first with a thank you. It's an honor to be here with all of you and with such a distinguished panel. And I want to pay special thanks. Sometimes I get a tear in my eye when I think about how hard Betty Cruz works. And I'd love if you all give her a round of applause. There's nobody I know that's doing more good for more people every day than Betty, and her whole team puts these things on, and I know we're all beneficiaries of it, so thank you, Betty. Let me just go back to my experience with this, because I think it forms a good baseline to take us from where we were just a short time ago to where we are. I was the U.S. Attorney here from 2010 through 2016, and it's now widely known that we led the investigation into the hack of the election in 2016. What we perceived then was two threat streams coming principally from Russia. One was a blunt attack on the election machinery in all 50 states to place assets sort of within the secretaries of state of all 50 states for purposes of mischief to be determined. At that time, we weren't sure whether they were in all 50 states. That's now pretty much resolved that they were. The public announcement at that time was they were in 7 states and they were actionable or in action in the state of Illinois. And that was based upon sort of a limited definition of what hacking was, which was at that time, show me that a vote has been changed and I'll take some action. At the same time, we had the troll farms in Russia that were feeding disinformation. The equivalent then of the restaurant that we just heard about was a Black Lives Matter rally on a street in Dallas. Across the street was a Blue Lives Matter rally. Neither one was legitimate. People showed up for both and engaged in conflict. Russia won if they sowed discontent. Russia won if they could interfere. Russia won if they created a lack of confidence in our election system. One of the things we were talking about before the panel is how careful we are, I am, about talking about election interference, because we don't want to be so blunt and when we talk about it that we do the job of the adversary for them. I mean, if someone said, I'm a thief, I'm a thief, I'm a thief, and I go to all of you and say, I just want you to know I'm not a thief, I'm republishing that falsehood. And there's a lot in the news that you should, if you have the interest to come out tonight, maybe you've already seen it, but if you haven't, take a look at it. There's a lot of information out there about how what happened in 2016 has become so much more sophisticated today. And in addition to Russia, which has been engaging in election interference for years, we're now worried about China. We're also worried about an infrastructure attack because the most pernicious malware attacking our infrastructure is the Volt Typhoon malware from China. And what I've always worried about is a combined attack on our election machinery, disinformation, flood coming from an adversary, combined with a real electrical shortage that would cause us not to be able to produce an election. So that's something to worry about. I think we've stopped hearing from sort of the right in the Trump campaign and the MAGA people that there's no interference because now they're talking about the Iranian interference into the Trump campaign. But you know, election interference has been going on, and our 4 principal adversaries on everything are Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and this is no different. But to directly answer your question, I would say this, and this is a very unscientific answer. Every problem that we are dealing with, when you add disinformation to it, is like putting it in the blender or that juicer that you make your smoothie in the morning. The power of disinformation is staggering. And I think to get to the end of the story, I believe that the power of community outrage is both equally staggering and the antidote. We as a community, writ large, have been able to overturn ridiculous things like the tolerance of drinking and driving, like the exposure to secondhand smoke in public places and restaurants, when for years we just let it go on. And I believe that the normal, healthy suspicion that Americans have of their government and authority needs to be turned off of the platforms of journalism and towards the purveyors of disinformation. And when community outrage reaches a sufficient high level, people will start getting their kicks, finding that the information that they're getting is false. And then we'll be on track towards getting better.
I like that. So put the community on the people spreading disinformation and calling them out. Okay, a call to action there. You mentioned Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. There's been, as you mentioned, a lot of news coming out about their efforts to influence this election. And one of the things, not repeating kind of the narratives or the storylines that are false that they're pushing, but that we try to do is talk about tools and tactics. And so there was a big DOJ indictment that really hit on a lot of Bret's work. But Bret, if you could speak to that a little bit and talk us through kind of what we learned on the tools and tactics front.
Yes, there's actually been 3 DOJ cases in the last couple months, all of which have involved employees of RT, which is Russian state media, which then the State Department came out a couple weeks ago and finally said that RT is just sort of an arm of Russian intelligence, when for years they've tried to sort of defend themselves under the sort of guise of being journalists and having free speech rights. So anyway, these 3 cases, they're all different, but I think the biggest one that shows the tactical shift is evidence came out that RT employees, so employees of the Russian government, had funneled $10 million into a Tennessee media company called Tenet Media that had hired 6 of the biggest podcasters, bloggers, influencers on the political right. And so what Russia has figured out, not that they didn't know this before, but the way to sort of circumvent our defenses against foreign malign influence, where the platforms are still doing work there, and the government is still doing work there, and everybody is comfortable taking down disinformation when it's coming from a foreign source. Nobody is comfortable taking down disinformation when it's coming from a domestic source. Now, misinformation, there's good reason not to take down every false comment online, obviously. There's been major backlashes there. But they realize our vulnerability is once they funnel something through a domestic actor, nobody wants to touch it. But in this case, I think what they were doing, it's not as if they were giving talking points to these podcasters. They had huge audiences before, but they were making, in some cases, $100,000, $200,000 a podcast or a video. And because they have huge audiences, they were essentially the bait to bring real Americans to this platform. And in the indictment, what they laid out is in a couple cases, the Russians did send directives to the owners of this platform. So to be clear, the podcasters were unwitting here. They did not know that there was Russian money being funneled into this company. The people who ran the company definitely did. And so I think they were just a bait to bring an audience to this platform, so the Russians had control of a platform that now had an authentic audience who were attracted to these podcasters. And in a couple cases, the most notable one was after the terrorist attacks in Moscow back in March. They sent a directive saying, you have to talk about the fact this was actually not ISIS, it was Ukraine and the US. So at these strategic, opportune moments, they were able to take advantage of this platform, take advantage of an authentic American audience, because what they figured out is it's hard to build audiences with bots and with fake accounts. You can build some, but those people don't have friends. They don't have real followings. So they're finding people who are real Americans who do have friends and real influence. And that, I think, is the tactical shift. But the money was pretty staggering, that they're willing to throw this amount of money at these podcasters.
Thanks, Brad. And there was, I mean, again, it's just, we follow this news closely, so every day it feels like there's a new kind of nugget out there. But there was recent reporting that Russia is the most prolific actor that's actually using AI in these campaigns. And so David or Bret, I don't know if you want to talk through kind of how AI is used by these actors. And obviously it's not just Russia that's doing this, but we get more information about how Russia is doing this, and this can inform on the tools and tactics side.
Well, maybe this will touch some of your own experience, that it'll be a visual that'll help you understand, but I have a terrible weakness for golf. So every time I turn on my device, there's an ad on my device that has been generated either by privacy intrusion upon me or some tool which has determined that I'm looking at selectively things that pertain to that. We were in Japan as a family a couple of holidays ago, and I decided the children we have 6 children who are all adults. None of them had ever heard of American Westerns. We started going through the famous actors. We settled on John Wayne, and we decided to watch a John Wayne movie. Pretty soon, everybody's phone is popping up with John Wayne movies. I'm convinced I'm going to get a surcharge from YouTube. We converted to YouTube TV. I'm addicted to YouTube now. I watch lectures on YouTube. I watch sporting events condensed on YouTube to get my Sundays back. I commend it to all of you. But when I watch something on YouTube, if you've ever done this, all of a sudden, if you start focusing on the Kennedy assassination, for example, you get a blizzard of things to do. So that is probably the best visual for me to show you how it relates to your life. Now, if you put that capacity in the hands of a malign actor like Russia, and if you doubt that they're not committed to this, you listen to Bret's story, in 2016, the DHS chief went to Maryland and said, in order to save money, you hired this company called ByteGrid. Do you know that ByteGrid is owned by a Russian oligarch? They were delivering the elections through the Russian oligarch in Maryland. And they said, oh no, we didn't know that. So we had to go through a whole process in this country of screening people for, but that's a two-time demonstration of their commitment if you doubt it. If you have them doing simple spear phishing of people such that they have access to components of the American cyber ecosystem, and they have the same tool using algorithms or generative AI to manipulate what you're thinking about or what you're watching or what you're triggering. It's just easy for me to see. And you know, I just wonder, by a show of hands, how many of you agree that this is a real threat, that you've seen enough of it? See, that's heartening to me, because again, before the program, I was saying that I've been doing a lot. I was in Michigan last week doing some election security work. I was on television 2 weekends ago, and my friends are calling me up, and I feel like I'm digging in quicksand, that they don't believe it. One of them asked me if I was watching too many James Bond movies, that the Russians are coming, and said, do you remember From Russia with Love? And I said, they're not coming, they're here. When we did our epic case here in Pittsburgh against China for stealing intellectual property theft from U.S. Steel, Westinghouse, Alcoa, the United Steelworkers, that was in 2014, 10 years ago. A key part of the delivery of that message about that theft was explaining to people how China did this through hop points. China had a vast architecture in this country of compromised computers. About half of them were people like you and me, half of them were other companies. So when the People's Liberation Army came through from Shanghai to infiltrate the U.S. Steel system, they anonymized themselves by coming through a binocular company in Kansas. So the people in the IT department in U.S. Steel would not think that this 2 o'clock entry or interest digitally coming from Shanghai was suspicious, because it looked like it was a binocular company from Kansas, or a person like me from Castle Shan. So that architecture exists, and when it gets activated, we're in trouble. And one of the biggest problems we have in talking about the election issue is people continue to resort to, show me that the votes were changed. We can't do that. I don't know that we'll ever be able to do that. But we can conclusively show that the platform architecture is here. I have been part of several FBI notices where we told the American public, including first thing on the evening news, reboot your router at home to create a patch to defeat malign architecture. Once that architecture is here, if you add AI to it or generative AI to it, you can, the ceiling is all, the limit of what your imagination is about what can be done.
So let's dig in a little bit about the intersection of these malign actors of AI and election administration. That's kind of how we think about it at ASD. You can only take small slivers of this at a time. And when we're looking at an upcoming election, we're looking at what are the things that could impact the actual election administration. And the way we think about AI is it's kind of two buckets. It's the cyber bucket. It's a supercharging agent on the cyber side, and it's a supercharging agent on the disinformation side. So I'd love to hear, David, I'll come back to you just on the cyber piece. When you're looking at the actual administration of elections, what concerns you, and what maybe, what makes you, is there anything that you're like, but we've got this, and that means we're okay?
Well, I'll take them in reverse order. One of the good things about our elections, particularly national elections, is it's 50 separate elections. So in all things cyber, dealing with all types of cyber threats, we have recognized that keeping things in separate buckets is one level of defense. And so you can't just hack the American federal election, you have to do it in various states. That's one thing we have going for us. The second thing is, on a bipartisan basis, with some heroic work by people who were being told not to do it, in 2018, in 2020 and 2022, we've kind of upped our game. I don't know the full scope of what we're doing, but I have the sense that we've done some offensive, defensive work, sort of in the football parlance, we've blitzed the adversary as opposed to just sit back. Those things make me feel better. And I think we now have a whole of government recognition that we need to do things. There's also, on the good side, I'm part of one group called Keep Our Republic, which I'll plug. It's a nonpartisan group working in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. I'm on the PA advisory board. That's what I was doing in Michigan. But it's a bunch of nonpartisan people whose names you would recognize, who are working to build community trust, to reinforce through local news organizations, local Kiwanis clubs, scouting, libraries, bar associations, that there are trusted places in the community that you can go to work on elections and screen information that you might get that might be bad. On the other side, I used to say to people when I would invite them to work with me as a cyber warrior, let me invite you to perhaps the most difficult mission you could ever undertake, where we're going to chase clever criminals who hide anonymously in the internet using disappearing evidence where the law moves too slow and the technology moves too fast. What we're talking about today might be moot by tomorrow. So the rapidity and speed of these technological changes in the hands of people who would use them bad or for bad is staggering. Look, when generative AI came out, some of the professors I was working with were very concerned that a student would use generative AI, and I said, look, on one level, as long as we preserve human judgment, generative AI is like the move from the timetables I used to do to the slide rule to the Texas Instrument calculator to what we do, the calculator on your phone. I mean, I'm old enough to have taken trips with my family where we would go to AAA for the entire day before and get a triptych, and we would get stamps where the construction sites are. Now I can't come to here without having a phone tell me how to get here. I was calling Betty on the phone pathetically. Right. So we don't want technology to slow to give us those improvements, but that which makes us human, that which forms our judgment. And I worked, if you know my history, I worked on the coronavirus crisis. I can only think of how we could have done a better job watching for fraud in the coronavirus crisis if we had AI. I did a program in Ireland on this very subject, AI in the next pandemic. But in the hands of a malign act, a bad person, AI can be devastating. So, we operate in good faith here on the assumption that it's the citadel of democracy, that these elections are going to be free and fair and they're going to yield the result where we elected our leaders. But if you are in a world where you have a free and open system and others seek to reinstall the Soviet Union by destroying NATO and destroying Western democracy, you understand the threat vector. And you put these tools in their hand, and I just don't even know where we go.
Bret, tell me, disinformation and election administration, what are, kind of the opportunities and tools that we have to push back there?
Well, I would say that the note of optimism is election officials are far more aware of the threat now than they were certainly in 2020. So you're part of this advisory committee. We're on calls weekly at this point with state and local election officials. So they are prepared, but again, it runs into a problem. If there are you as persons who are at the center of a mis or disinformation campaign, the tech companies are not going to touch it. And this actually is a change from 2020. You can look at the platform policies and they have radically changed since 2020. We obviously know Elon at Twitter or X, he's changed them because of ideological reasons. Zuckerberg has made the change because of political calculations. But there used to be platform policies about spreading false information around elections. Most of those are gone. The one area that is still safe for them to operate is taking down content that would suppress the vote. So anything around time, manner, and place of voting, they will still take action, and it's illegal. And so there have been a couple of cases there. But we don't have a ton of great tools when they're coming from domestic actors because it's a free speech issue. And again, the pendulum has swung since 2020 in the other direction of saying, don't touch this because we don't want another Hunter Biden laptop scenario. So if it's coming from a domestic person, domestic outlet, there's not a lot we can do other than counter it with election officials going out there and trying to get accurate information out there. One of the challenges, though, is there's often an inverse in the amount of information people have who are skeptics and people who trust elections. People who trust elections do not understand how elections operate because they just show up once every year, 2 years, 4 years. They believe their vote is counted. That's all they know about it. Election deniers know a lot about elections, so they have real granular details. Now, there's usually a glitch in their information system, but they're able to win those debates online. So again, when it comes to domestic people spreading mis or disinformation, there's not a lot we can do. When it comes to the foreign actors, I think we should be heartened by some of the cases we've seen in the last couple months. This is also the first election where we have what's called the Foreign Malign Influence Center that is set up and operational as part of the Director of National Intelligence. That did not exist in 2020 or 2022. So there's some positives on the foreign side, and I think we're better prepared there. The domestic is what concerns me because I think we've moved in the wrong direction since 2020.
May I add one other thing?
Yeah.
I think one thing you might want to focus on is whether our respect for the rule of law is better today than it was 4 years ago and 8 years ago. And then when you look at these election threats, do this exercise. Go on your X account. I have an X account just because I must watch what's going on X. I don't ever post. But if you click on a video, then you get a sequence of videos and count out of the 10 videos that you look at, how many involve a dispute between people that's resolved with physical force. And ask yourself the question if that's proliferating and it's growing. Because if we resolve our disputes by physical force and we no longer respect the rule of law, then you rationalize and you authorize what one of the January 6 people said on 60 Minutes the other day. Well, I believe the election was stolen, so I had the right to go to the Capitol. No, you did not, because there were 60 cases decided by courts unanimously saying that your belief was wrong. So even if your belief was well-founded or correct, you still don't have the right to resort to physical force. But if we're being pushed digitally or through AI or generative AI or by troll farms to believe that if we have a dispute outside there, we're going to laugh at how this fight breaks out, then I submit to you that that foundational glue which holds us all together, the rule of law, is being eroded. And that's part of this whole picture as far as I'm concerned.
It's why Russia and Iran can be successful, is because there's a lack of trust and a breakdown of trust within our society and democracy. So last question from me, and then we'll open it up to folks, but I'm going to try so hard to, equip people. So I question for you both: what can an individual do in this type of information environment at this point, we're like, protect yourself and the people you love and their community. So what are some pieces of advice you would have?
Well, don't be part of the problem, right? I mean, it's this stuff still all works through friends and family. I mean, the most destructive misinformation that often dovetails with disinformation is when real people in your circle spread that, especially if they're trusted and they have wide networks. So make sure you verify information, don't be part of the problem. But the other thing is, I think you should actually small size the problem, because when you look at the issues that we have in information right now or in democracy, they are too big to overcome for individuals, and that leads to apathy, or it leads to sort of hopelessness of like, I can't possibly fight the flood of misinformation I see on Facebook, even if it were my full-time job, because it is my full-time job and I can't do it. So just downsize it and say, like, I'm gonna take care of my block, my community group, my religious organization. I'm gonna try to make sure they have accurate information about voting. So I think to get people not in a space where they feel apathetic, because that's what disinformation can do. We worry a lot about disinformation radicalizing people and inspiring people to action and showing up for Jan 6. We don't worry enough about it inspiring people to inaction, where they just go, I don't want any part of this, so I'm gonna go work on my golf game. That's a problem too in a democracy. That's great for Putin. That's what Putin has done in Russia. It's not that people believe the Kremlin, they believe they have no ability to change anything there. So I think we need to kind of make it a digestible bite for people to take action, but downsize the problem. Worry about your neighborhood, your block, your community, and don't worry about this big thing that you can't change.
And that dovetails with what you were saying at the beginning, David, about kind of fighting back against the disinformation, but I wonder if you have any other thoughts.
Well, I think that answer is a great answer. I have found it hard to apply in my own life, so I offer you this clinic and how I've tried to apply it. When I hear something from a family or a friend, I say, well, where did you hear that? And what screen did you put on that to determine whether that's true? And at the back end of it, you're off the Christmas list, you're out of the will. I mean, I'm kind of haven't figured out how to get from the middle to the back. But I try to take it one conversation at a time. And obviously I'm spending a lot of time and energy. My main mission right now is to apply law to digital space. In a nutshell, that's what I've been doing the last 10 years. What I did against China was because if you did what China did to Westinghouse, you'd be in prison. So why isn't China in prison if they're feasting the American legal market? And when we were doing the cases against Russia, and we had the ball for China and Russia here in Pittsburgh, it was to expose the fact that Russia had a vastly different signature of criminals who roamed wild, who were then harnessed by Putin for statecraft when he wanted to use them. So if we exposed that criminal enterprise, that criminal network, that was useful. Now in the election security space, in the disinformation space, when we talk about algorithms, our first step, literally, door number one, is to make sure people understand what's going on. When we did the algorithm study here in Pittsburgh about predictive policing, we said to people, look, AI isn't necessarily bad. It gets you out of the Steeler game faster. When it snows, it tells Public Works where to take the snow plows. But if you're going to use it based on zip codes to send the police or to decide who's going to reoffend, then we're putting AI on top of historical patterns of racism, and it's not right. So let's talk about how we use it. And the same is true here. By you coming out tonight, you're officially patriots. But you got to go from here and carry the message, because it's just person by person, block by block, community by community. I still find the majority of the people that I deal with are skeptical about all of this. And I think Bret hit on it. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that Americans would run in a parallel lane to Russians on this by trying to cause mistrust in our election process. I grew up when Richard Nixon, who had plenty to say about what happened in Illinois, conceded the election. Al Gore, if you've forgotten or you're too young to know, lost by 500 votes in Florida, and 10,000 Gore votes were thrown out because someone thought that when they punched a hole in Gore and it accidentally knocked out Pat Buchanan, the ballot was invalid. Now that was the legal ruling, and everybody said the rule of law applies. But he had a far better argument that he was president than anyone else, not mentioning any names. But the idea that a person running for this office with an oath would cause people to doubt, to say it's rigged, I can't even imagine. And the battle that we have is a substantial part of the population is buying it hook, line, and sinker. Now look at this. As a young boy, when I went to kindergarten, I still remember David Hughes, David Hickton, we were wrestling, we ended up getting our milk money envelopes switched. For the first time I got chocolate milk. My mom would let me have chocolate milk, and poor David Hughes had to have white milk. That's how crisp those memories were. But what was also crisp at that time to me is if someone talked to me in a loud voice, I said, oh, whoa, whoa, they must be mad. If they frowned, I said, well, you know, there must be. If they had a bias, you know, if I could sort of bias out, it would help me filter every piece of information I got orally or in writing. You have all those tools. You have none of them when you're on the internet. And the information I was getting from Mrs. Robbins at Highland School in Castle Shannon was 100% reliable. I can tell you that. The information you're getting over the internet is not even close to 50% reliable. I'm a football fan. The part of football season I love best is free agency. Do you follow? You know, Matt Stafford's coming to the Steelers. If you follow Twitter during that season of football, people throw things at the wall to see if they stick. And the internet is full of that. So how is it, and what's happened is, it's become a tool of not only overseas adversaries, but domestic adversaries. And it is up to community heroes to change that.
Very well said. Whoa, that was close. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
And I'll bring the
Please.
mics. Okay, you in the corner, and then, yeah, there you go.
Go ahead.
The folks, I appreciate your the conversation during presentations. The focus has been around AI, but as you're talking, I'm thinking about the struggle in my own life with talking to people about this is what I'll call alternative facts from news media, which is online and on our TVs for the generation that still watches TVs. And recently, you know, we've had conversations with people where you're getting your information if you try a different source. And someone recently gave a presentation that said that is not very effective because it further, it makes people dig in further that their source is the right source and the other source can't possibly be. So in addition to AI, this whole, whether it's for an actor or just, you know, profit making, how do you know, what strategies do you use to counter that type of information as well?
I've confessed that I'm ineffective at it, so maybe you can.
No, I'm also a hypocrite, and this is why I don't go on my personal Facebook unless I'm selling some of my kids' gear on Facebook Marketplace, because it enrages me, and I don't feel well equipped to have those kind of battles or confrontations. But I think the key thing is not to make it a battle or confrontation, and don't do it publicly. I mean, I see this with some family members who get into public spats, not with each other, but people on their Facebook feeds. take it offline, take it privately, and say, lean into their argument. So don't start with the, this is ridiculous sort of thing, which is hard to do. And there are some conversation stoppers. I mean, if someone who thinks lizard people are running the US government, you don't go very far from there. But if it's somebody who's concerned about election integrity and has a legitimate question, lean in and say, okay, like, that is a legitimate concern. Let's kind of talk through here. Let's look at sources here. But I say that as a hypocrite, and I don't do that much in my personal life. I try to do it professionally, but it's hard.
I commend all of you a book that was published by Rand called Truth Decay, like Tooth Decay. And it's, you know, it's a paperback book, so it's relatively easy read, but very important. And it gives you hope because it tells you we've been here before. Kennedy assassination is cited, the Watergate, Pentagon Papers, Vietnam, where people lost faith in their government and their institutions, and we started to have an erosion of trust because if the government lies to you once, then why do you believe them the next time? So part of the Russia problem is we have this accumulation of mistrust. And when you talk about election security, it isn't like America has been perfect in handling elections, and our own hand in Chile and Iran and Vietnam isn't exactly a great story. But Truth Decay gave me hope that we can come out of this, but I come back to the power of all of you and the power of community outrage. Because I really think, you know, all the way back to 1776, healthy skepticism of our government, healthy mistrust of our government was built into the system. You know, we the people, it was a federalist republic, and it was built to try and keep government close because we didn't want to be told. We were afraid of what the example of England yielded. And so I think that healthy mistrust is in our DNA. Now, right now, it's being directed, and if you read Truth Decay, they take mainstream and cable media apart on both sides with equal measure. I mean, I don't frankly think myself that it's the solution if right-wing media is so polarizing and so untrue at times that we create left-wing media to be equally polarizing. That doesn't solve the problem. And they take MSNBC and Fox apart in the book, and I think you'll enjoy reading about that, and it'll stimulate your thinking. But how do we consume our news? I mean, we haven't talked about the 24/7 news cycle, which has now been eclipsed by all the news we get digitally. We used to just watch the news from 7 to 7:30, right? We had time to reflect. Yeah. And they were all trusted. Some of the young people in the room probably don't know what we're talking about. Really, they don't. I mean, I have perceived in my work, I think this is worth saying, whether you're talking about privacy or elections or trust, that there's an age divide between people who did not grow up on the internet digitally and people who only grew up digitally. So I'm a little bit more critical because I know what, you know, utopia could look like. But if you just give up and say everything's on the internet, nothing's private anymore, you know, you have to sort through this, and you know, a lot of it's not true, and just sort it out. I just can't live that way.
And I'll take moderator's privilege a little bit and throw an idea out there. I think very quickly we can get into, you say, someone says the elections are rigged, and you're like, no, the elections are perfect. Or there's nothing to see here. Like, we can fully trust our elections. That's not how the system was set up. The system was set up to catch mistakes. And so if the answer to saying the election is rigged is to say, no, there's nothing wrong with our election system, it's perfect, you're getting into a battle you can't win. There are always going to be irregularities. And the goal shouldn't be perfection, but it should be catching those mistakes quickly and correcting them quickly. And that's what our like really spectacular election officials do, and do so transparently.
Well, let me give you some tools on that subject, and you can cite me. Part of my responsibility from 2010 to 2016 was to appoint an election security officer who's an assistant U.S. attorney, and working with the FBI, we went and looked for election fraud. We never found it. Okay, it is a myth that there's widespread election fraud. If any of you vote twice, you're committing a crime. Don't do it. It only happened twice in 2020, and both people voted for Trump twice in Pennsylvania. It is a myth, but I think you have to confront what the people who are sowing mistrust are saying. They say, well, students vote where they go to school, and they vote where their dead people vote. They're talking about essentially the category of stewardship of the lists. I've witnessed this. It's people are being good stewards of the list. You may find someone there who has to be taken off the list, but on a general basis, most of the efforts to do stewardship of the list are within what has been the only through line in elections in this country since we were created, and it's a sad story. We have used elections to disenfranchise people, not to enfranchise people. We told people if they were a certain color they couldn't vote. We told women they couldn't vote up until 100 years ago. We told young people who were going to war they couldn't vote. And now we're telling people in certain states who may not have identification that they can't vote. Now, the whole subject of voter identification is something that's longer than this conversation. But the myth of election fraud needs to be debunked when you talk to people, and just say, give me your evidence that there's election fraud.
I can take the second part of that question first, because our next stop next week actually is going to Philadelphia to meet with influencers around the election and to try to get them to be more influential in talking about the election, making sure that they understand how election works, connecting them with state and local officials, because we understand at a DC think tank we have at times an influential but very small group of people who go and read our products. And election officials, typically their job is not around being really persuasive on Instagram. So you gotta pair it up with celebrities. or influencers. And influencers from spaces you wouldn't necessarily think of, you know, the mommy bloggers, the lifestyle bloggers. Like, if they're talking about politics and elections, let's try to connect those dots so they can be spreading a positive message, or at least just an accurate message, as opposed to leaning into misinformation. The regulation question, that also could be an entire session unto itself, but a lot of states are starting to make moves now to regulate AI, particularly AI's uses in elections. So California just passed 2 or 3 bills last week. Several other states have. I don't know if you have the full list, but it's a lot.
19 states, and then there's 7 more in the hopper. And that like really points to the failure of the federal government to do anything on this.
Yeah, so from the federal government, I would not be optimistic. I mean, it's not going to happen before the election. Like, they're gone until after the election now anyway. But we've had the Honest Ads Act since 2016, which, if you don't know the Honest Ads Act, it's basically just getting online to have the same rules as offline. So if you have a political ad, you have to run a disclaimer and pay for the ad. And obviously that can be misleading because a lot of the disclaimers are, you know, patriots for America, but at least it's something you can follow up on. It doesn't exist online. This bill is just to bring those two things to make them aligned. Amy Klobuchar brings it up basically every single year, and it just hasn't moved. And it's like the lowest hanging fruit, seemingly. So I'm a little bit pessimistic about federal regulation around AI, but it's happening at the state level, and it's happened overseas. I mean, the Europeans have done it, the Brits have done it, so it's possible, but I'm pessimistic at the federal level.
I think first that's a fantastic question, and I think the answer is equally fantastic. I would say, as a lawyer, we have tried to regulate advertising, and we found we couldn't under the First Amendment, and in the famous case, Citizens United, we tried to restrict money, and we couldn't. But what you're really talking about is diluting your influence over your vote, whether it's someone bad or maybe Taylor Swift is good because she has 2.3 million followers. But you know, every day you make decisions where you're being influenced. You're not going to the grocery store and buying on a neutral slate. You've been influenced by facings, the color, the message for the products. When I was a lawyer practicing, we did focus group work to try and understand how the deciders, the jury, would decide the case, to frame our message. So the line between fair persuasion and manipulation is what you're searching for, and it's against the backdrop of the First Amendment in this country.
And just one more brief point. Sometimes you don't need to create new regulation. You need the people who are in charge of enforcing regulation just think a little bit differently. So if you look at attempts to suppress the vote, whether they're using AI or not, the crime is still the crime. So look at the underlying crime, and it doesn't matter the tools and tactics they're using. Like, if they're using leaflets in neighborhoods to tell certain demographics not to vote, to confuse them, that's the same as if they're using an AI-driven campaign online. And there have been a few limited cases that show you, like, you can make these cases. And going back to 2016, there was a guy who was targeting Black and Latino voters with messages saying you can text in your vote. Vote for Hillary, text in your vote. And he was charged and he was convicted. So focus on the crime. Don't worry about how complicated the technology is, because that throws a lot of regulators, because, to be honest, a lot of regulators are older. They don't understand the new technology particularly well. And even if they did, the technology moves so fast that frequently we get this, like, by the time we regulate this thing, it's the next thing. But don't worry about the technology, worry about the crime and enforcing the laws that we already have.
Hi, so I have a two-part question. Are these attacks on our infrastructure and election considered cyber warfare or cyber terrorism, and how severe must it be to initiate a military response from our government? And the second part would be, what would be a standard military attack or response to these attacks?
So during the Obama administration, there was a draft presidential policy directive that was based upon the work of former Pitt Chancellor Pat Gallagher when he was the head of NIST and in the Department of Commerce, outlining what our critical infrastructure was. And it was amped up by the Trump administration, specifically John Bolton, to suggest an attack on any aspect of our critical infrastructure would be met with a nuclear response. And everybody said, wait a second, we don't want to do that. And so we're still in the formative stages of our policy making about how do we respond proportionately to cyber attacks. When President Biden first met with Vladimir Putin in Vienna, he specifically took him to task over election meddling, as did President Obama, and added election machinery to our critical infrastructure list that had been created first in 2013. So, outstanding question. You're probably going to decide that. But the question of all, as we see across the globe on a variety of conflicts, the question of proportionate response is largely governed by the vague notion of international law. And within the cyber world, we call it cyber diplomacy. I did a program at Harvard and MIT in 2017, which was called Cyber Law, Cyber Treaty, Cyber Norms 5.0, which should tell you by then it would have been 4 swings and misses before that, and there's still no universal treaty on what's acceptable response. Excellent question.
Excellent question. I think you're the right person to answer it. Bret, no, nothing to add. Okay, all right, great. Let's move on.
Years ago, I was to a national conference of election directors in Minnesota, and the first speaker said, let me begin with the election directors' prayer. Lord, that this not be a close election. There's always been misinformation that's been out there. The 4th election of the President of the United States had the extreme misinformation by Thomas Jefferson against Adams, and familial connection there. I do feel that pretty bad. But there's been this sort of thing going on quite a bit. The voting process as a judge of elections for over a decade, I can say it's not with the election process, but I tell them it's with the, as Ross Tweed said, I don't care who gets elected, as long as I get the candidates. And so much of the process is before election day. That's what the corruption is. You mentioned Citizens United, because the big thing is with all this money coming in, that is so polluting the situation. From Adams race on, we've had yellow journalism happening with the printed media. All this sort of thing has been happening all along. But so I'm going to say that we do need to have better civic education. I don't even know if they're teaching civics anymore in schools. There really needs to be more in it. But there is other corruption out there. People know it, they feel it, they see things happening that they know aren't quite right. And in dealing as an advocate, challenging public election for over 40 years now, that has led to some major actions. A lot of people get it wrong. They think that what they think is corruption may not be, but they miss what really is. And this is where we need to have more education to identify this. But as I said, it's not that I see anything that's going to be affecting election day, because I know how many things we have to do in counting. The big thing, the news about Georgia having to, or North Carolina was having to count ballots now.
Georgia.
We do that here. We just do it. First we count our unused ballots, and we have to mark down, and we have to count how many we have to get.
And they have to match up, yeah.
So we still account for all of that. That's nothing unusual. But, so that's, I don't see this, cyber as the biggest thing, except that the big money behind this and misinformation is happening. And how we're going to address that, we'll have to see.
Thank you.
I'll just ask a quick question. I don't know how many thousands, especially of young people,
involved in another project trying to inspire youth vote, and that's basically the answer there is this matters to you. But look, if young people voted, Eugene McCarthy would have been president, Howard Dean would have been president, Bernie Sanders would have been president. They participate but then don't vote. So getting the youth vote to a reasonable level would be an achievement. And look, if you look at the Obama phenomenon, he expanded the electorate in 2008. That was as much a part of his success as anything. And one of the interesting things with the ascent of Kamala to the top spot is we sort of have like a British election now. It's 90 days. If I were constructing the American election and someone gave me power for a day to reform it, we would have a narrow election cycle, and it would be illegal to campaign outside of that cycle. And the people who would be elected would govern as opposed to be perpetually campaigning. And, you know, other reforms as well. But people have to care. They won't only act if they care. Look, I'm going to stimulate their meeting in Philadelphia by telling you a story about influencers. We don't have any influencers in the room here, do we? So I told you I'm a golf addict. I was teaching in Scotland this past semester, and I went up to play golf at Royal Dornoch, where I'm a member, and I saw a big bus, and I saw these beautiful 40 people, and they were all walking around with sticks on their arm, and they were videographing everything they were doing. And I said, "What is this?" They said, "They're influencers from America." I said, "What?" They said, "Yes, this British clothing company has paid them to come to Scotland. They're playing all the great golf courses. There was a bagpiper with them. They were staying in 5-star hotels because if they said that this clothing product was good, it moved the number." I said, "Well, how do you become an influencer?" "I'm paying for my trip." They said, "You have to have 1 million followers on either Facebook or Twitter X, and then you qualify." These people were so full of soup, it wasn't even funny. They didn't do anything unless they videoed themselves. They would talk like this, and then they were posting in the middle, and it's an entire new world. But it shows you the power of this. I mean, you might say this doesn't matter, but this is an entire new delivery mechanism. They say that particularly the AI impact on our life is going to be as profound as any transition that we've experienced in humankind.
Brad, did you have any advice?
I'm usually the sort of doom and gloom guy. You should do this because you're usually more optimistic.
No, that's true. I was reminded, I have 2 friends that I went to high school with that are here tonight who live in Pittsburgh, so that's exciting. And I was reminded of our AP World History teacher, Mr. Cumming, who would always say, if you don't vote, don't complain. And so if you want like one line, and particularly with younger people who, activism is like kind of, a lot of it is social activism, but they grew up in like what they see is like a very activist generation. I think that like kind of putting that civic responsibility back on them could be helpful. It worked with me, clearly stuck with me a while.
This is not what I would recommend they would say, because I don't think anyone would understand this, but I lived in Hungary from 2007 to 2011. And political apathy among my friends there, because I was obviously younger then, was enormous, because they just looked at all of their options as being bad options. So they disengaged entirely. You had Orban come back in, and nobody really cared, because it's just, like, it doesn't matter for us. It matters to them now, but now it's been dismantled. There's no free press, the judiciary has been ripped apart, and so if it's not important to you now, when it is important, it might be too late.
This is just a local point about Allegheny County voter registration, voter history data, which I've worked with for a long time. It's my favorite avocation. I don't play video games. I play with the voter history data. And there's been publicity about a local group that says there are too many people registered to vote who should be kicked off the list. This is an invitation to corruption. This is no good.
Are registrations up this cycle?
Yes, they are, and yes, they are. I just got I went and said, do you have a new distribution? And they said, yes, would you like a thumb drive? Of course I will. It was so beautiful. And it was dated September 13th. And of course I looked at the 34th Steakhouse District. That's what I care most about right away. And Republicans are up a little bit with the Democrats. But it looks, it's not surprising, it's not phenomenal. The one thing I did notice is there's a Gateway Rehab Center where there are lots of Republicans registered to vote newly since May. The last snapshot I had was May, and here are 11 new Republican registrations at a Gateway Rehab Center.
Bret, could you talk a little bit at how, real charts and numbers that have a simple explanation can be used to, spin up kind of more nefarious ideas of what's actually at play?
Yeah, one of the big narratives in 2020 was this idea of what was called, this is not a real thing, an F curve or a fraud curve. It's not a thing in statistics, but became a thing online, effectively to say that there is a statistically improbable spike in votes for one candidate that allows that candidate to surge ahead of the other candidate. And we saw this recently come up again in Venezuela, after the Venezuelan contested elections, where they were trying to show, again, this was this F curve, where, again, the idea is there's a ballot dump that happens at the 11th hour, and all of a sudden you have a candidate behind and get this huge surge, then you go ahead. But it actually is statistically probable when you look at how votes are counted and then how votes totals are released. So if you have a major city or county with a large population releases their vote totals in mass, that looks like a spike. And if that county is all Democrat or mainly Republican, that will be a spike. That's what you expect. Same thing happens with mail-in voting. And the different ways states count mail-in ballots is if they were releasing those totals in mass, and you know that more Democrats, as was the case in 2020, were going to send in ballots, that will be a spike. This is to be expected. But again, this is a tough conversation to have on Twitter.
Yeah, nuance is lost. All right, we are coming to time. So David, do you have any final thoughts?
No, thank you all for coming out again. Really appreciate it. And, greatest country in the world. We rule ourselves, I think.
Bret, anything on your end?
No, just to echo the thanks, and especially to the World Affairs Council for having us. This was great. I actually love this format of the roundtable and made a really interesting discussion, so thanks.
And thanks everyone for joining us here and your comments and insights. We appreciate it. And y'all are really the folks, like we all have to kind of take on this responsibility and push back and make our communities better. And so, thank you for being here.